Petr is a postdoc researcher who recently successfully defended his PhD thesis in French, and his PhD thesis received Bolzano Prize for the excellent work from the Charles University. Petr specializes in investigation of relations between contemporary French phenomenology and Deleuze-Guattarian theory. And as you can see, in his contribution, he is going to focus precisely on the relation between contemporary French phenomenology and Deleuze-Guattarian theory of event. So, Petr, please.
Thank you very much, Petr, for the introduction and also for the organization of the whole event. I think it was a great idea, and I'm happy to be here. I've divided my talk into 4 parts. In the first one, I will very briefly comment on the relationship between Deleuze and phenomenology. And in the third and in the second and the third part, as I think that the ethics of the event mentioned in the title of my presentation is the only possible solution to the crisis of humanity. So these 2 parts will be devoted to the notion of crisis, respectively in phenomenology and in Deleuze and Guattari. And then finally, I will be thinking about how such an ethics of the event could be formulated in phenomenological terms. First, Deleuze and phenomenology. As you all know, Deleuze is always critical of phenomenology, while phenomenologists try to get rid of objective or conceptual presuppositions via the epoche or phenomenological reduction. They are unaware, says Deleuze, of the subjective ones, burdening their descriptions of experiential content with what Deleuze calls the image of thought. The image of thought is a matter of conception of thought as recognition or positing, doxa, in which the universal thinking subjectivity harmonizes all its cognitive faculties by making them revolve around an identical object. For example, Husserl thinks that the world is differentiated into objects that are constituted by transcendental consciousness. According to Deleuze, this is the case not only of Husserl but also Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists. In contrast to them, Deleuze is interested in the very genesis of experience within the immediate flow of the subjective transcendental field with no subjective identity or synthesizing power. He is interested in a more radical genetic phenomenology dealing with what goes beyond phenomenological correlation of corporeal subjectivity and corporeal world. However, contemporary French authors such as Henri Maldini on the left, Marc Richir on the right, Jean-Luc Marion, Renaud Barbaras or Claude Romano belong to the youngest branch of phenomenology dealing with the eventful dimension of appearing, événementialité d'apparaître. In other words, new French phenomenology, that is, phenomenology in France after the first reception of Husserl and Heidegger, approximately from 1960s onwards, this new French phenomenology constructs its plane of immanence very similarly to Deleuze. The plane of a subjective contemporary phenomenology communicates with the Deleuzean one by radically refusing the subjective doxa and by putting an emphasis on the second pole of the phenomenological correlation, on the transcendence, giving itself as an event in which both poles of the phenomenological correlation, subjectivity and the world, are ceaselessly co-born. As the relationship between Deleuze and contemporary French phenomenology only rarely becomes a topic in Deleuzean literature, in my today's talk I am going to attempt to examine the intersections between contemporary phenomenology in France and Deleuze's metaphysics. I will do so with regard to a very fundamental question common to Husserl phenomenology and Deleuze and Guattari: the crisis of humanity and its solution. And I will claim that contemporary French phenomenology, considering the phenomenon as an event, should make another Deleuzean step and develop its own version of the ethics of the event. For it is only this ethics that constitutes an adequate solution to the crisis. So, I move to the second part of this talk, crisis in phenomenology. Crisis is first and foremost a phenomenological topic. The crisis of humanity concerns sciences which are not phenomenologically founded. Its core is that the progress of sciences is not accompanied by our greater understanding, but on the contrary, by greater alienation from reality as described by sciences. Sciences have nothing to say about our vital need, says Husserl. Positive sciences dominating the modern age led humans to see everywhere facts. That is, what is objectively determinable, although what might give sense to objectivity, can only be found on the side of subjectivity, abandoned by positive sciences. After making this diagnosis, Husserl sets out to combat the crisis by analyzing its evolution, by showing how science detached itself from the sense, and how this trend could be reversed. He calls for the integration of sciences into the absolute element of sense, which is nothing else than famous Lebenswelt, the world of our life. Such foundation of empirical sciences consists, according to Husserl, in the description of phenomenological essences of their objects. The phenomenologist must first observe in the intuition the essence of a scientific concept as it gives itself in pre-scientific evidence, which leads her finally to prescribe to this or that science its method, to delineate a priori the field and its laws, which all the scientists must respect. But this specific Husserlian solution of the crisis, that is, the foundation of sciences in transcendental subjectivity, which is highly problematic both for Deleuze and contemporary phenomenology, is not important for me in this talk. What is important here, and what brings Husserl closer to Deleuze, is Husserlian move from the theoretical to the practical. His conviction that the alienation of humans from reality, as described by sciences, will be overcome once the narrow scientific conception of reason, according to which reason became only an equivalent to the theoretical and empirical experimental procedures that served scientific progress. So this narrow conception will become part of a broader Greek conception of reason, according to which reason is not only theoretical but permeates the whole practical life, the whole world of our life. In early Deleuze, this move would correspond, in my opinion, to the move from the actual to the virtual, in the sense of the sufficient condition of the actual. Thus, the crisis of empirical sciences turns out a starting point for a broader problem. The foundation of sciences is but a part of the problem of the practical unity of all human life, the problem of an immanent ethics in Deleuze. Such unity must be understood as a phenomenological foundation or clarification of all human activities, including, for instance, political or social ones. It is the ideal of an empirical phenomenology, which is a meta-ethical ideal of phenomenological authenticity in the spatio-temporal world. Pure phenomenology, to put it in other terms, pure phenomenology in the sense of a pure description of the virtual conditions of experience cannot be the last word. The discovery of absolute transcendental subjectivity of the virtual in Deleuze gives a new sense to everyday human life. One has a new vocation, says Husserl, of living in apodicticity, according to a priori principles described by phenomenology, a vocation of being worthy of virtual events in early Deleuze. I will address this ethics later. Now I have to sketch the evolution of phenomenology that has come even closer to the Deleuzean conception than Husserl himself. Since the publication of Husserl's famous book on the crisis, many authors have reformulated his call in their own terms. And contributed to the formation of a new branch of phenomenology. Deleuze's transcendental empiricism deals with the subjective flow of experience that belongs to nobody. What seems to be sovereign subjectivity constantly loses itself in the violence of its encounter with being itself. Surprisingly enough, phenomenology as practiced today in France also understands the appearing of things on the basis of their own initiative, with the paradigm of phenomenon being an unpredictable and always excessive event, in relation to all the concepts by which it might be described. Thus, for example, Jean-Luc Marion affirms that these eventful phenomena, which he calls saturated phenomena, are everywhere around us, and that we have to understand ourselves not as subjects of our experience, but as receivers of those constantly escaping phenomena. To give an example, the room in which Marion is giving one of his lectures gives itself not as an object, but surprisingly enough, as an event. It does appear as an object. It meets all the requirements of the phenomenon as object, but there is also an excess of its sense, giving rise to the impression that all the stable contours of the object are ceaselessly flooded by a unique complex of various impressions, whereby the room gives itself at its own initiative. It emerges as a fact coming from the uncontrollable past about which we know nothing, says Marion, and appears not as room as such, but as the room of this afternoon, as the room of this context, with this audience and this given subject, which Marion or me now are thematizing in our respective lectures. It is the room giving itself as a singular event that cannot be grasped in every detail. Phenomena in contemporary French phenomenology are first and foremost a work of what manifests itself through the event. An event is, as has been shown by Levinas, who might be the most important predecessor of contemporary authors, an expression of appearing transcendence, which acquires the role previously attributed to subjectivity. And it is, I would like to add that it is only thanks to this transcendence, thanks to our openness to it, that phenomenologists move to the level of radical immanence, in the sense of Deleuze, that they go beyond the borders of subjectivity. Consequently, subjectivity is no longer understood as an ego, but as a self, as radical passivity called by the transcendence of the world, as experience that is deeper than my experience, and has the power to radically transform who I am. As you might have noticed, the images, pictures are supposed to be funny, so don't take them seriously. It's not the exact illustration of the concepts I'm talking about. Thus, contemporary phenomenology seems to be an actualization of Miguel de Beistigui's idea of a phenomenology of difference, which would be a discourse on singularities, presupposing no invariant, a phenomenology of becoming. Of course, there are still some important differences between Deleuze's and phenomenological empiricism. While phenomenology tries to follow its principle of evidence, staying very close to phenomena, even though these are ephemeral and situated on the boundaries of intentional consciousness, Deleuze expresses himself in a post-structuralist or metaphysical language, enriched especially after his collaboration with Felix Guattari, by that of various exact or human sciences. This allows Deleuze and Guattari to be more radical in their description of the genesis of experience, not to be dependent on human experience and its evidence. Thus they can observe how the whole earth, la Terre, is populated by non-human populations and minorities genetically preceding humanity. The appearing of something to human consciousness presupposes the multiplicity of intensive impersonal individuations. Be that as it may, these differences should not obscure the striking systematic proximity between Deleuze and contemporary French phenomenology. Provided that this is a fact, it is surprising that contemporary phenomenology seems almost completely to ignore Deleuze's shift towards the ethics of the event. And it is all the more surprising because, as has been shown above, Husserl himself placed an emphasis on the practical dimension of phenomenology, on the problem of how to live phenomenologically. When one thinks about the reasons, the main one seems to be this: the proper object of contemporary phenomenology is a newly understood phenomenon, that is, the description of the invisible axis of phenomenon understood as an event, and not the prescription based on this description. For example, the goal of Maldini and Romano of their phenomenology of the event, the goal they ascribe to themselves is to broaden the classical phenomenality of Husserl and Heidegger, early Heidegger, by describing the first phenomenon, the event, conceived of as a rupture in an individual existence. Their task was not to find out how the becoming of human existence could clarify or ground sciences, or more generally, all human activities in the spatio-temporal world, in the situation of crisis. So such description, their description of the event, remains unaccompanied by any more practical Husserlian move of returning to the empirical. On the one hand, it seems that neither Maldini nor Romano can be blamed for anything, because we are obviously on the very boundaries of phenomenology. In Husserl, the practice of phenomenologically founded sciences is part of a metaphysics, in the sense of a science of factual reality. And yet, on the other hand, one feels the need, following Husserl's steps, to push phenomenology towards these boundaries and pose the question related to phenomenological life in the factual world. Why should one do it? Because all our reality, our real experience, resides in our dynamic life world, in our sensation as the element of events happening only once, and because we do not see it through the thick layer of what Husserl calls the natural attitude, and Deleuze the image of thought. Then the question one must ask oneself is this: how exactly would such a phenomenological life based on the descriptions of eventual existence look like? And this is precisely what Deleuze investigated under the term of the ethics of the event. The ethics to be developed, I think, in phenomenology as well. So now I move to the third part on the crisis in Deleuze and Guattari. Surprisingly enough, Deleuze too is a thinker of the crisis of humanity. All our reality and the reality of everything around us is made up of singularities events. Even on the surface of the most boring and repetitive activities, a singular sense never ceases to shine, says Deleuze. Being is the eternal return, but what repeats itself is difference. The difficulty is that human consciousness is an incarnation of a natural or transcendental illusion inherent to the eternal return. Human consciousness registers effects, but it knows nothing of causes. It registers things, but not their incessant genesis, the process of their individuation. And once a classical metaphysics is born, says Deleuze, in difference and repetition, the natural illusion becomes the greatest error. Singularities, events, the excess of sense are completely lost underneath the image of thought that, for moral reasons, eliminates the difference disrupting the order of forms of the perceived world. So according to Deleuze, the crisis of humans closely related to this illusion and the error they commit consists in their incapacity to become other, in their incapacity to actualize or incarnate new possibilities of life brought to them by events. In their common text devoted to May 68, Deleuze and Guattari write about the crisis of French society, incapable of changing after the pure event of May. It's quite a long quotation. The possible does not pre-exist. It is created by the event. It is a question of life. The event creates a new existence. It produces a new subjectivity, new relations with the body, with time, sexuality, the immediate surroundings, with culture, work. When a social mutation appears, it is not enough to draw the consequences of or effects according to lines of economic or political causality. Society must be capable of forming collective agencies of enunciation that match the new subjectivity in such a way that it desires the mutation. That's what it is, the veritable redeployment. The American New Deal or Japanese boom corresponded to two very different examples of subjective redeployment, with enough initiative and creativity to provide a new social state capable of responding to the demands of the event. Following 68 in France, on the contrary, French society has shown a radical incapacity to create a subjective redeployment on the collective level, which is what 68 demands. However, as is evident from what was said above and from what Deleuze suggests in his second cinema book, the crisis of French society is only a visible symptom of a more general crisis which, similarly to Husserl, affects humanity in general, whether on an individual or societal level. Cinema after World War II, Italian neorealism or French New Wave, depicts so-called pure optical and sound situations in which humans find themselves incapable of action because something intolerable or too powerful happened. The modern fact, I quote from Cinema 2, The Time Image, the modern fact is that we no longer believe in this world. We do not even believe in the events which happen to us, love, death, as if they only half concerned us. The link between man and the world is broken. End of quotation. Thus, today's most difficult task is, according to Deleuze and Guattari, to renew the link between us and the world. Humans need to discover a mode of existence that would be in harmony with its processual character. In What is Philosophy, they write, it is possible that the problem now concerns the one who believes in the world, and not even in the existence of the world, but in its possibilities of movements and intensities, so as once again to give birth to new modes of existence, closer to animals and rocks. It may be that believing in this world, in this life, becomes our most difficult task, or the task of a mode of existence still to be discovered of our plane of immanence today. End of quotation. Indeed, the only possible solution to the crisis consists in the belief in one's flesh, share, as an element where events happen. Humanity as a whole needs to establish the community of brothers or explorers who believe in the world of events, the community of experimenters who do not follow any morality of rigid and stable transcendent principles, but an immanent ethics of new forms of life emerging with events. Only such a community will embody the social arrangement capable of launching the war machine and thereby finding its lines of escape, transforming itself, something the French society failed at in 1968. In other words, the biggest task of today is nothing else than being worthy of the event, as Deleuze puts it before his encounter with Félix Guattari. That's the quotation from Logic of Sense. Either ethics makes no sense at all, or this is what it means and has nothing else to say. Not to be unworthy of what happens to us. Nothing more can be said, and no more has ever been said. To become worthy of what happens to us, and thus to will and release the event. To become the offspring of one's own events, and thereby to be reborn. To have one more birth, and to break with one's carnal birth. End of quotation. Being worthy of the event involves basically two things. First, the liberation of the event as such, beyond its spatio-temporal actualization, but also, second, the willing of the embodiment and the actualization of the pure incorporeal event in a state of affairs and in his or her own body and flesh. Interpreting the Stoic theory of ethics, Deleuze writes in this context that the Stoic sage wants the event to be represented in the spatio-temporal world. I quote, "The Stoic sage not only comprehends and wills the event, but also represents it and by this selects it." End of quotation. This necessity to represent the event at the level of empirical facts is expressed even more clearly elsewhere in negotiations. What we most lack is a belief in the world. We've quite lost the world. It's been taken from us. If you believe in the world, you precipitate events, however inconspicuous, that elude control. You engender new space-times, however small their surface and volume. Yeah, and there's also a picture because engendering new space-times is creation. So, in other words, after the contra-actualization of the event corresponding approximately to the phenomenological epoche, allowing us to see the excess of the event over its actualization in the natural attitude, one needs to choose some of the new possibilities brought about by the event and incarnate one of them in the state of things. In our lives, we must proceed in a similar way to that of the painter Francis Bacon, to contra-actualize all the clichés inside our heads, to discover a diagram of our encounters, to break free from the given patterns of the image of thought, and finally to create one of the possibilities offered to us by events, that is, to say something or act somehow. And it does not matter how precisely, because a particular action is related to our personal, always singular history, and to the singular way events cut across our bodies. By doing this, we are supposed to create a work of art of our own life, out of our own life. Its image crystal in which the actual will communicate with the virtual. Only in this way can one find one's line of escape, just as Deleuze and Guattari, in the writing by way of reaction to the pure event of May 68, their famous book entitled Anti-Oedipus, which opens up an array of new ways both for them individual and for the whole society. It opens new directions not only in philosophy, but also in politics, psychoanalysis, economics, sociology and other disciplines, because embodying the excess of an event in the empirical world of narrowly defined sciences is possible only through interdisciplinarity. So I skipped to the last part of my talk about the possibility of such an ethics of the event in phenomenology. Is such an ethics possible in phenomenology? Are there any authors sketching something similar to this Deleuzean ethics of the event? An interpretation of a fluidization of scientific concepts, which seems to consist in an interdisciplinary approach, can be found in Marion's work, in what he calls hermeneutics. Having determined the mode of being of subjectivity as the gifted, adonné, that is the receiver of what gives itself as an event, Marion becomes aware of the fact that his adonné is not condemned by the domination of positive sciences to non-saturated or objectified phenomena, in which the eventful process of phenomenalization would become lost from view. Indeed, as adonné, it is always open both to non-saturated and saturated phenomena. The crisis consists in that this existential situation of subjectivity, in which it has a choice, falls into oblivion, and adonné prefers non-saturated phenomena. It literally pulls things, objects of scientific inquiry, out of the depth of the world, eventful world, and transforms them into objects in the sense of that which is thrown in front of us, and consequently completely controllable and manipulatable. This is exactly what has allowed the exact sciences to develop to such an extent, says Marion. So, how could one escape the crisis and give the sciences a solid phenomenological foundation according to Marion's phenomenology of giveness? In an attempt to give a phenomenological foundation to historical science, Marion thematizes the Battle of Waterloo as an object of Adonné's hermeneutics. So I quote a passage from Being Given. In recorded and transmitted history, the battle will demand additional horizons, this time conceptual, of an indefinite number. Military horizons, the strategy adopted since the return from exile, the tactics concerning displays, diplomatic, political, economic, ideological, reference to the revolution, etc. The plurality of horizons practically forbids constituting the historical event into one object and demands substituting and endless hermeneutic in time. The narration is doubled by the narration of narrations. More, in this hermeneutic labor, the proliferation of horizons implies also the proliferation of the sciences used, as well as of the literary genres. End of quote. Given the fact that such demultiplication of horizons is an approximate response in the empirical practice of historians to the excess of sense implicated in the saturated phenomenon that is every historical event, it seems that it may serve as an inspiration in our search for the ethics of the event that would not forget the necessity of a new actualization of the event in the empirical world. To this new actualizations correspond exactly interdisciplinarity of historical science. So to conclude, Aldous Husserl and Deleuze share the move from the pure description of experience to prescription, by which I mean practical consequences of description. The solution to the crisis offered by them differs due to the different planes of immanence on which they think. Whereas Husserl strove to ground human practice in transcendental subjectivity, Deleuze forged an immanent asubjective ethics of the event. However, a long time has passed since the publication of Husserl's Crisis, and phenomenology has radically changed. It has come very close to the Deleuzean conception, stressing the dynamic nature of human existence. With one exception, contemporary French phenomenology hesitates to follow Husserlian or Deleuzian move from description to prescription, to this practical side of philosophy. In attempting to ask why such a move might be important and what it should look like in the case of the phenomenological description of the eventful dimension of existence, I've presented Deleuze's ethics of the event, which constitutes his solution to the crisis. Deleuze's conception of ethics subsequently helped to interpret the practical move as the second move following the contra-actualization of the event. The move from description to prescription consists in choosing some of the new possibilities brought by an event and embodying one of them in the state of things. Finally, similar moves were found in the work of Marion, foregrounding the need for the fluidization in objective sciences and an interdisciplinary approach. Such an approach is all the more important as the crisis concerns not only sciences but all the human practice, affecting both human and non-human beings. As long as the relationship with other people, other living beings or nature in general is rooted in thought based on common and good sense, the image of thought in Deleuze, or in the natural attitude and the closely related scientific naturalistic attitude in phenomenology, then it has similar consequences in all cases. It leads to the reduction of other human beings to their places in the world of representation, that is, the world of shared uniformed truths, ideologies and instructions, and to the reduction of nature to a mere object of human activity, to raw material which humans manipulate following their selfish anthropocentric projects. If the crisis is at the same time social, political and ecological one, there are countless very concrete and urgent reasons why we should endlessly strive to be worthy of the event. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Which made me think of the difference between pious and unpious approach to the event. As you know, the phenomenologies of event, contemporary phenomenologies of event, are often related to the so-called theological turn in phenomenology. I'm just thinking of Marion's saturated phenomenon, whereas Deleuze-Guattarian view on event is obviously atheistic, unpious, even though in the second volume on film, Deleuze refers to leap of faith, to Kierkegaard's notion of faith, even though it's the belief in the world, as you mentioned it. So I wonder, how would you differentiate this pious and unpious approach to the event? Is it just a matter of personal taste, of certain ethos, or is there some structural difference? Would you be able to specify this difference? What makes the difference between this pious and unpious view of event?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this question. First of all, I would like to say that Dominique Génicaud's book on theological turn in contemporary French phenomenology is a tragedy for phenomenology. It's a disinterpretation of what is going on in contemporary phenomenology. You know, he basically says that phenomenology, and he has three big targets. It's Marion, Henry, and Levinas as a predecessor of these contemporary phenomenologists. And he basically says that what they do is that they substitute, that they use in phenomenology terms that have no phenomena behind them, that they use metaphysical or theological terms coming from theology, that cannot be supported by phenomenological evidence. As you may know, Jean-Luc Marion and others protested fiercely against this interpretation, even if it is true, even if it's true that Marion deals with religious phenomena. You know, one cannot deny that. He proceeds purely phenomenologically. You know, his method is phenomenological. So to answer your question, I would say that contemporary French phenomenology in general is or take this ambiguous approach to the phenomenon of event. But there are, of course, authors like Marion, like Lacoste, like I don't know, Emmanuel Falk, for example, you know, who are interested very much in religious phenomena and in describing our experience of these phenomena, but they proceed purely phenomenologically. That's the most important thing I have to underline. Yes, so I think that that both contemporary French phenomenology and Deleuze, Guattari take this atheistic approach towards phenomena, and one cannot reduce contemporary phenomenology to these, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 big thinkers who are interested in studying religious topics. So.
Okay, fair enough.
That was wonderful, and I agree. I think that the rejection from the Deleuzian side of, so Deleuze rejects phenomenology, and then sort of just, it really has been limiting in terms of, in a lot of ways, and I think that it's a great way to sort of compare or the natural attitude and the image of thought, and just show how they're doing similar things, and they're sort of the overcoming of both of those is really fundamental to Deleuze's project as well as phenomenology. So, but my question, so thank you, that was very clear. I have a question, and it's a question that actually plagues me with the ethics of the event and the being worthy of the event and what it means. And it's really, so everything that you said is exactly the way that I would also describe, interpret counteractualization, this sort of, and you get to the point where you can see these other possibilities and you say, you know, but then there's a principle of, there's a selection, and we can reincarnate or incarnate this, so that's part of the ethics of the event. And my question has always been, but how? Or, so what is there a principle of selection, right? So a lot of times Deleuzians are critiqued for promoting creation for creation's sake, but is this really sufficient for an ethics, right? Is finding a line of flight enough? Or is there a need to say that this is a kind of first step, and it would be the absolute necessity, right? So the basis would be to sort of open up these different possibilities, and to, but I always, what then, right? What is the principle of selection? You have some people who want to go with the ideal of health, or look to Spinoza and talk about joyous affects, and I wonder, which possibilities get embodied? Is there a principle of selection? And are there resources in more contemporary phenomenology that can help us actually move beyond the initial step in methodology that we're talking about to how to proceed?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to admit that I read your article on counter-actualization, published in 2016, I think. I even cite you in my Czech book on Deleuze. So I know that you're dealing with this topic.
And I don't have the answers to any of those questions, so I'm really...
Is there any principle of selection? I think there is no such a principle. I mentioned in my talk that how exactly we behave ourselves based on the event affecting us depends on our personal history, on who we are, and depends also on our bodies. You know, we all are affected in single ways by events. Events are impersonal, of course, but we are always affected personally, singularly. And I think that contemporary phenomenology of the event, André Maldinet and Claude Romano, who uses this concept of personal history, might be useful for you, because he explained exactly how is it possible that being given that event are impersonal, you know, how is it possible that we react to them differently, always singularly, yeah. Because of this personal history that is understood as a sedimentation of all the events we experienced throughout our life. So,
yeah.
read Romano.
Can you mention who did you just cite? Which?
André Maldinet and Claude Romano, who is his successor. I think the first phenomenologist talking about the event in phenomenology was André Maldinet, okay. And Claude Romano in his PhD thesis then was published by PUF, a prestigious publisher house in France. He systematically developed what Maldinet says about the event.
That's very helpful.
So I come completely from the outside. I don't know Deleuze very much, but just based on your paper, maybe this is more, if anything, just a comment. But dovetailing on what you both said, it seems like a key element that you mention would be the idea of the flesh, and then you also bring up the incarnate embodiment, and it seems like if you move toward this actual physicality, feeling, flesh, pain, suffering, grief, horror, say Oedipus didn't take out his eyes and actually dealt with what he did, that this would be maybe a first step toward allowing a world or something uncontrollable or transcendent to actually touch you. And if there's a danger, then maybe it could be something along, and I'm not very familiar with this whole gaming world, but this virtual existence that we're moving toward, or these sort of mandates and processing of our bodies, takes us even further and further from the flesh, and or the disgust we feel with, let's say, the homeless person who urinates in his pants, or the grieving Arab screaming and wailing. But really just the comment being that it seems that this repulsion we have of the flesh and this, and maybe moving more closer to it, which would be almost savage, could be a window into this other,
yeah, thank you. I would like to mention two phases, or how we are affected by events happening to us in our lives. The first one is how we experience, how exactly events cut across our sensibility, and the second phase would be that of creation, that of choosing something from the new possibilities emerging by these painfully experienced new events. For contemporary phenomenology, especially for Henri Maldinet, this sensation and corporeal experience of event is extremely important. While Claude Romano, which is interesting, is more Heideggerian. So for Romano, sensation is always already subordinated to the understanding of being. So it is as if he excluded corporeality from his interpretation of what event is. I wanted to say we experience it corporeally in our flesh. It cuts across our sensibility. It reconfigures the whole of our existential possibilities, they say, these authors, and then it's up to us to first of all see that the reconfiguration is a new one, and to adapt our behavior, our thinking, everything we do to this new situation. As for the repulsion, you've been talking about homeless people urinating and so on. I don't know. I don't know how could I connect this experience with what these authors say on event. I would have to think about it more. There's
Okay,
one more.
Last question.
Yeah. Just
Sorry.
to follow up, the way you say that, yes, we kind of use our sensibility to process the experience, and then it is up to us to define it as old or new. Somehow it is connected to me to the notion of phenomenological object in itself, and it somehow parallels for me what Henri was proposing in terms of auto-affection, and the way he kind of would not say ignored, but skipped auto-objectification of the body. Because the body, in order to process what you are saying, the product of sensibility, should kind of treat itself as its own body in order to attribute this newness or familiarity to the experience. So, would you say that any idea of this embodied auto-objectification is observable in the phenomenologies that you have discussed?
No. Michel Henry is a very specific case in contemporary phenomenology. It looks like he's like a black sheep of contemporary phenomenology, because this turn to the transcendence and to the events by which this transcendence manifests itself and so on, which is in the center of interest of contemporary phenomenology. He's not interested in it at all. He somehow picks up on what Husserl says, and he's even more radical. And even more radically develops Husserlian notion of radical immanence, subjective immanence. So it's very difficult to say where Michel Henry is situated with regard to these concepts. But he is also post-Husserlian phenomenologist, of course. So he shares some very important things with these authors, but at the same time he goes the other way. So